Why is the war of words between Ethiopia and Eritrea now raging? And where is it headed? There are signs that the war of words that Ethiopia and Eritrea have been exchanging is now more intense than ever. Ethiopia has dismissed Eritrea's accusations that it has entered into Ethiopian territory and occupied certain areas, and supported militants as false and fabricated. The Ethiopian foreign minister, in a letter sent to the Eritrean foreign ministry on Saturday, January 30th, 2018 Ethiopian calendar, called on the Eritrean army to withdraw from Ethiopian sovereign territories it claims to be under its control and to be ready for negotiations. Eritrea's information minister, in a statement issued yesterday, February 3, 2018 Ethiopian calendar, stated that Eritrea has no intention or desire to add fuel to a pointless conflict and to escalate the situation. In a statement issued yesterday, the TPLF accused the Ethiopian Defense Forces of conducting large-scale movements into the Tigray region. The TPLF, which said the movement was preparing for another round of war, said the Ethiopian government had been carrying out air and ground attacks in the Tigray region in recent weeks. This has resulted in the loss of human lives. We spoke to political analysts from the Horn of Africa about why the war of words between Ethiopia and Eritrea is currently raging and where it could lead. Dr. Nedra Gadeta, a Horn of Africa political analyst based in Germany who completed his doctoral thesis on Ethio-Eritrean relations, says that Addis Abeba's recent letter to Asmara indicates that Eritrea has reached an assessment that it is involved in the conflict in the Tigray region. It has been reported that clashes broke out in the border areas between the Tigray, Amhara, and Afar regions a few weeks ago. In particular, reports have emerged that Tigray forces have engaged in fighting with the Ethiopian army and Amhara militias in the disputed areas of Selamet, Megale, and Abala, where the Tigray and Amhara regions share territorial claims. According to Dr. Nedra, the Ethiopian government, which has reached the conclusion that Eritrea is involved in this conflict, has written a strong letter to Eritrea. The analyst, who said that the two countries have been simmering for about 2 years, explained, "I think the Ethiopian government has escalated it to this level because it believes Eritrea has a hand in that conflict." In a letter to United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres in late September, the Ethiopian Ministry of Foreign Affairs accused the Eritrean government and the TPLF of working together to deliberately wage war on Ethiopia. Diraj Yimmer, a PhD student in political science at Addis Ababa University, says the Ethiopian letter is not instantaneous. They also believe that the Ethiopian government is part of a movement to prepare the ground for a sea gate. They state that the Ethiopian government's persistent stance that Ethiopia needs the Red Sea in relation to gaining access to the sea could lead to condemnation from the international community. For example, if Ethiopia were to enter into a war in the Red Sea, it would not be feasible, as it could be embroiled in a conflict in terms of international law and the Algiers Agreement, says the political science student. Therefore, they explain that it is in a sovereignty crisis and is preparing the conditions to take action to protect its sovereignty in accordance with the United Nations Agreement. Using the UN article that states that if a country is in danger of sovereignty, it has the full power to avert that danger at any time. They're claiming that Ethiopia is in danger in terms of territorial sovereignty and are pursuing an acceptable course of action. Since the Eritrean government has invaded Ethiopia, is violating Ethiopian sovereignty, and has created a political situation that is putting Ethiopia in a state of limbo. Any forceful action taken by Ethiopia to reverse this will not create diplomatic pressure that would condemn or deter the international community. If Ethiopia enters the conflict by doing something that makes things fair, the researcher says, it will not be just about expelling Eritrea. The Ethiopian government has maintained that the historical mistake made in the Algiers Agreement should not be repeated. They explain that after a conflict breaks out, it will find a political framework that will allow it to sign a new agreement with Eritrea that includes the Red Sea or the Aseb. Therefore, they believe that the letter sent from Ethiopia to Eritrea was not a sudden decision, but a well-thought-out decision. The conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which joined forces in the Tigray War, has intensified since the Pretoria Agreement, with the Ethiopian government's claim to a seaport. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, in a speech to the House of People's Representatives on January 26, 2018 Ethiopian calendar, said that Ethiopia will undoubtedly find a seaport either in Bale or Bole. The Ethiopian government has raised the issue of the Red Sea on several occasions. It is worth noting that the Eritrean government has dismissed the talks regarding the Red Sea as a nightmare. In early January, the Ethiopian Federal Police said they had seized thousands of rounds of ammunition sent from Eritrea to militants operating in the Amhara region, prompting Eritrea to accuse Prime Minister Abiy's government of looking for a pretext to start war. London-based East African political analyst Abdurrahman Syed Abu Hashim says the exchange of letters and statements between the two countries leads to suspicion and conflict. Although Ethiopia claims that Eritrean troops are present on its territory, they believe that not being clear about the areas in which they are located shows intended harassment. If it were true, it would have been possible to identify which areas were involved and resolve them through mediation and dialogue. It is to pretend that such issues exist when fighting breaks out in Eritrea, they say. He noted that the Red Sea issue has played a role in the dispute between the two countries. He said that the issue is not something that any country would accept if it were to enter Eritrea's sovereign territory. Where does the argument lead? Asked where the current conflict could lead, Dr. Nedra said that while the possibility of a major war is less likely, it is not impossible. I would say that for now, the chances of front-to-front air-to-air fighting, as was the case in the previous war in Badme, are slim. Over time, a year or two later, or if something goes wrong in the middle, a war could break out. They explained that the two countries are still engaged in a Cold War between each other, supporting the rebels, referring to the period of neither peace nor war that existed between the signing of the Algiers Agreement and the coming to power of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Ethiopia is not the first to declare that Eritrean troops have violated its sovereign territory and occupied areas by force. In July last year, Ethiopia's representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Tsegab Kabu, said that Eritrean troops were patrolling areas along the Ethiopian border and that reports of serious human rights violations in the border areas continued to emerge. Ethiopia has repeatedly called on the Eritrean government to refrain from violating its sovereignty and borders, but has not clearly stated when the violations occurred. Ethiopia has now accused Eritrean troops of advancing further into the northeastern border of Ethiopia than they previously controlled. In its response, the Eritrean Ministry of Information condemned the Ethiopian government's letter, saying, "Unfortunately, this is another tragic act in the pattern and cycle of hate campaign against Eritrea that has lasted for more than 2 years." Political science student Derage believes there is a desire on the Ethiopian side for a third party to intervene. When a third party comes in, it's not just about borders. Previously, there was a lot of pressure from various parties to create a new agreement that included a SAB or the Red Sea. He explains, "The Algiers Agreement contains colonial treaties that have lost their value or legitimacy. The Ethiopian government has emphasized that that historical mistake will not be repeated and that the agreement is legally invalid. A new agreement with Eritrea, including the border, is required through a third party," he explains. They add that Ethiopia wants third-party intervention, creating pressure to create a situation that is nothing short of war. Dr. Nedra warns that if the two countries' conflict leads to a military conflict, the war will not only be between Ethiopia and Eritrea, it will be regional and it will be catastrophic. On the one hand, Egypt and Somalia support the Eritrean government, while on the other hand, Israel and the United Arab Emirates say they support Ethiopia. On the other hand, Dr. Nedra adds that while Ethiopia has oil trade and investment ties with Saudi Arabia, the UAE siding with Ethiopia could force it to turn its attention to the Eritrean government. East African political analyst Abdurrahman also has a view similar to Dr. Nedra's. If this conflict starts, it will not be limited to Eritrea and Ethiopia. Other countries will be forced to use this opportunity as an opportunity to intervene and move to protect their interests, they say. He also mentions the intervention of powerful countries such as Iran and China in the conflict, which he says forces countries in the region to live in poverty. They also say it could lead to a conflict that could disintegrate countries like Ethiopia, Sudan, and Somalia. They add that it could cause similar chaos in Eritrea.